Hello, welcome to my channel. My name is Vanessa. I want to preface by saying I'm so sorry I did not post for 3 weeks. I was taking medications like off and on that were making me really dizzy to the point where I couldn't even stand up most days. So outside of having the energy to like go to my 9-to-5 job, I just didn't have the energy on the weekends to film anything. But I did have a lot of energy to read and listen to a lot of audiobooks and just books in general. So I did want to talk about my August wrap up, even though we're getting into like mid-September territory here, but it's happening. I want to tell you. So I did read 11 books, which is a lot for me personally. I'm like breezing through my Goodreads goal right now. I think my goal is 50. I don't really set high goals for myself reading wise because I'm generally a pretty slow reader and I can admit that, but I don't know. I think all the dizziness, I just had time on my hands. So I wanted to tell you about all the books that I read in August. Okay, the first book I finished in the month of August was Shatter Me. This is in my previous video, which is where I read a bunch of young adult, like famous young adult books. Shatter Me, it does look to seem that I gave it 1 star on my Goodreads here. I think if I had read it at a time where I was like a teenager and I was like 15 years old, I would have probably ate it up and been obsessed with it. And I do hear that it gets better as the series goes on, which doesn't surprise me because I have, and I do mention this in my vlog, that I do think that like the world building of this dystopian kind of setting could be really interesting. So I'm sure they elaborate on that and everything. Shatter Me is about a girl named Juliet who is cursed with having her physical touch cause pain and sometimes even death to anyone that she encounters. We meet her in this sort of old school insane asylum where she's only eating like once a day and she's not allowed to go outside and she has a very small window, and she does give us some backstory about how this is a dystopian world that has been just ransacked by global warming, and there's a food shortage, and then now there's sort of this fascist regime in place, which we learn to be is kind of just a bunch of teenage boys, including Aaron Warner, who I guess is like the commander or something like that. Anyway, she is taken under wing of Aaron Warner, who is an important commander, I believe, of this regime, to work kind of as like a torturer almost because of her ability to inflict pain with her physical touch. So I think that she would be great for negotiations and things like that. So it's about her strife in her life, especially her emotional toll of kind of having this her entire life and not being able to make connections with people. And then also her developing relationships with this boy that she meets named Adam, who is part of the regime, but she does kind of develop this romantic relationship with. And then Aaron Warner, who they have this sort of like sparring, weird dependent relationship, since Warner does need her, but she's like scared of him. Anyway, honestly, there's not a lot of plot in this book. I feel like the plot must come in the next few books because for the most part, you're just sitting through pages and pages of this very like Rupi Kaur-esque poetic writing that just is very immature in my opinion. I want to know if this author kind of gets better as it goes on, because for me, it just doesn't it doesn't work for me. This book is, I think it was fun to read, and I'm glad that I know what everyone's talking about now. I think this is objectively not a good book, and I'm sorry if that hurts to hear. I totally respect if you are like really attached to this series, because I bet if I read this as a teenager, that'd be me. Anyway, that is Shatter Me. That was the first book I read. But now we get into some good stuff, because the next book I read was The Spear Cuts Through Water by Simon Jimenez, which is like a polar opposite experience to reading Shatter Me. I don't even know how to describe it because it's a little bit of a confusing book. You just kind of have to be along for the ride, but it's one of those books where it's a story within a story. So in sort of like our present day, there is this boy, and he's kind of growing up in what we learn to be is a time of war, and he gets told stories by his grandmother and then his grandfather about the old country, which is where he is a descendant from. And at first you're kind of unsure if this is just like tales or if this is like a real history of a real existing place. It's a story within a story because we're being told the story from the grandparents, but then we are suddenly transported in the narrative as if we are seeing things through the first person point of view of our main character of the epic tale that's being told in present day. So basically what it is about, if to my memory, that was a really complicated book and it's been a minute. So the epic itself that we're being told is about this boy named Kima, who essentially gets wrapped up in this epic destiny to bring this lost empress, or she's actually a moon goddess who has been trapped for centuries. He has to break her out and then take her to this other location. And he is joined by June, who is an heir to this very oppressive regime of the old country, but he's got this sort of like guilt-stricken past that he's trying to make amends for. And Kima and June's relationship is a little bit at the central of this epic tale. The way that it evolves is really, really interesting. I want to say this is an enemies to lovers, but there's something a little bit like deeper than that. Like it feels a little bit weak to call it an enemies to lovers, because this is just such a fantastical, mythical, epic tale. And it's written just so gorgeously, and the action is really great. And then the way that it all comes together at the end, there's some like meeting of timelines that goes on, a la kind of Russian Doll in a way. And like my mind was just blown by this book. The whole time I was reading it, I was like, I can't believe that this came out of a human person's mind. Like, how did Simon Jimenez even think of this? I mean, it was incredible. It was really an amazing experience. And if you haven't read it yet, I highly, highly recommend it. So that was The Spear Cuts Through Water by Simon Jimenez. I loved it. The next book I read was a short story by Tasman Muir called Undercover. Tasman Muir, if you don't know, that's the author of Gideon the Ninth, which is what I'm reading right now, and I'm really enjoying it so far. This book is really hard to explain because I think that it's purposefully a little bit dropping you into a setting, and then it does give you enough context to understand what's going on, but I don't think it's gonna hold your hand. So that was one thing that I struggled with a little bit, which is why I'm struggling to like recount my thoughts on it. But I do really like grotesque, like very weird, strange short stories in particular, and this is exactly that. So basically Amy arrives to this isolated gang-run town. So it's a little bit got like a 20s gangster speakeasy vibe, but it has a horror kind of edge to it, because in this speakeasy run by these gangsters, they have these women called ghouls, which are essentially like the performance acts. And what these ghouls do is they eat like live animals and perform weird, grotesque acts on stage, because they're essentially zombies, like if I could put it in a simpler terms. And so Amy is tasked with being the bodyguard to one of these ghouls, who for some reason is very important to this gang leader of this bar that we are in for most of the setting. And you kind of get to learn a lot more about the history of Lucille and the history of the head of the gang and what their kind of relationship was, and kind of the exploitation of Lucille in this way. And it's really hard to explain, but it was also really good. Like, I mean, it's like a 2-hour audiobook or something like that, and I fully enjoyed myself the whole time. I love stuff like that. I highly recommend it if you're someone who loves weird, doesn't mind some gory type stories. So this was really fun. I love it. So that was Undercover by Tasman Muir. Okay, the next book I read is The Tainted Cup by Robert Jackson Bennett. I've been saying I was gonna read this since the moment that it like came out basically, and then I just put it off. And I kind of regret reading it in the context that I did, because I listened to this as an audiobook at a time where I feel like it just wasn't an audiobook type of book. I think I needed to be sitting down and reading this, because there's a lot of characters in this, and I think that I just got a little bit confused. It was still a really good time and I really enjoyed it still, but I just wanted to, like, full disclosure, say that I was a bit confused in it, and I think I wouldn't have been if I read this like on my Kindle or something like that, as opposed to an audiobook. And just because like the fantasy world building this is actually pretty high caliber for what I thought going into it was just kind of gonna be like a buddy cop investigative procedural whodunit with like mystical elements, but this is really like pretty high fantasy for that type of story. So, which was really fun. And it's just that I regret the kind of form that I ingested this, because it didn't really work for this particular story. But basically this is like a Sherlock Holmes murder mystery where the magic system in this world is very rooted in like plant life. So there's people who kind of dedicate their lives to studying the magic of certain like roots and things like that. Basically, the story starts when one of the high imperial officers of the empire is found dead with this magical tree growing out of his body, and they're able to deduce based off of that this was a planned attack and someone had essentially poisoned him with one of these like mystical roots, and he's not the only one that died in this manner. So there's been several different people that died in several different places, and it's a procedural about connecting the dots when they were all poisoned, who did it, who was where. And one thing that was really fun is the whole buddy cop thing that I mentioned, because Din is sort of this fresh-faced new investigator who's trying to do his very best and prove himself as best he can. He's also an engraver, which means that his memory is like perfect all the time. He can't forget anything, which makes him especially good at this sort of job. And he's working alongside this very famed investigator named Anna, who is such a queenie to me. Okay, even when I was really confused listening to this because I was distracting myself, and honestly that's on me, even when I was really distracted, I would stop and pay attention whenever Anna was speaking, because she's so funny. Like, she's got this very like almost Devil Wears Prada like harshness about her, but like also at the same time she's like not so worried about like tact. And so she's just really fun because she knows she's smart. Like, she knows she's that girl and she doesn't let anyone tell her anything. And she's able to jump to conclusions, but she also like has a very good like gut instinct most of the time. So she's just like very intelligent and very witty, and also like kind of just gets right down to business. And so like, and she's like this older woman in this particular field. And so I loved her. I thought she was incredible. Like, that's like one of my new favorite characters that I've read this whole year. So even if like the plot was a little bit lost on me, I loved Anna. And another thing I love about this book, in the background of all this murder mystery happening, there's also a Leviathan that is about to essentially destroy this entire empire, and I love a Leviathan story. So that was a really fun kind of backdrop, adding a sense of urgency to this whole investigation. I highly recommend it. I would just say, if you're someone who, you know, an audiobook is going to distract you, or like just read it in a way where you can actually focus on it, because that was on me. I just didn't read this at the right time. But I gave it 4 stars because objectively this was pretty fun and it was good. So that is The Tainted Cup by Robert Jackson Bennett. Okay, the next one I've had on my to read for so long, and I'm so glad that I finally read it, but I read The Hike by Drew Marguerite. I guess I was just in a really like, I wanted weird books, especially after reading the Tasman Muir Undercover book. I was looking for something strange, and this is the most strange you can get. Like, you are flying by the seat of your pants in this book, and it's also very funny. So basically what this is about a man named Ben who goes to this sort of isolated remote mountain town to this motel for some sort of business conference that he was doing, and he decides before the conference starts that he wants to go on a bit of a little walk or a hike. The woman who works at the front of the hotel is like, there's no hiking trails here, but he's like, screw it, I saw a hiking trail, I'm just gonna go follow it. So he goes down this trail, and very soon his Wi-Fi gets cut off. He has no access to any cell service, so he starts like writing in his notes like, oh, at the twin trees I turned left, to make note of where the main road is so that he could find his way back. As the night is coming down onto him though, he realizes that all of his notes are irrelevant because none of those landmarks exist anymore, and the landscape is basically changing around him as he goes. And on this hike, he essentially just encounters a series of ridiculous and incomprehensible horrors, one after another. The first one starting off with this kind of serial killer with like a machete or something, like some weapon, with a skinned dog head as a mask chasing him down. At one point there's this blue crab that talks with like this Jersey accent or New York accent or something like that. There's an enormous grasshopper. There's just a bunch of madness. And we don't really know why he's been chosen to be in this situation or what the outcome is supposed to be. And it's not too long of a book, honestly. I think that it was like a really fun time though. Even though it kind of gave me this weird existential dread, and you'd understand that once you read it. it also was very, very funny, and I think it doesn't take itself too seriously, so I'd recommend you go into it expecting not to take it too seriously and just being along for the ride, because this is one of those ridiculous on purpose, but also it was like well written, and I actually cried at the end of this one. So I really enjoyed that. I put off reading it for a long time, but I think I read it at a really good time. I think also it's a great Halloween read, since quite a bit of what he goes through is objectively horror. So I would recommend reading it in October or September for, you know, a little spooky read that's more lighthearted, but that is The Hike by Drew Marguerite. It's great for fans of really weird books, so recommend that. Okay, I have a new favorite book series. I think I'm so excited. So this is 3 books. I'm just gonna kind of put them all in the same category, so this video isn't like 2 hours long, but I read the entire Strange Practice series, and I'm just surprised because I never hear people talk about it, and I think I saw one book in Barnes & Noble one time, and any other Barnes & Noble I've been to, they don't carry these books, and I'm just really surprised because this has like a lot of elements that I just thought would be really popular with fantasy fans. It's more of a paranormal fantasy as opposed to like a, you know, fairies and warlocks type fantasy, though witches and fairies do exist in this as well. So what this is about our main character, Greta Helsing, my girl, Greta Helsing, and she comes from a family lineage of medical professionals whose specialty is supernatural creatures. So there's a lot of emphasis on vampires, so a lot of our main characters are vampires, and she ends up, you know, having a romantic subplot with one of these vampires. She also works with mummies or ghouls who don't really like speak English as a language and live in the sewers, and also like witches, like one of her assistants is a witch kind of deal. And it's very like whimsical and lighthearted, but the stakes are very high in this, like especially in the second book. There is definitely still like a sense of urgency in a sense of like life and death on the line. This is also one of those supernatural books where Christian mythology is considered like part of the supernatural world in the way that like Supernatural the TV show is like that, in that very like 2000s, mid-2000s way, which I really like because I personally actually really love Christian mythology explored in a supernatural way, so don't be jarred when you see that, because that is an element that comes up at the end of every single one of the books in this series. Every single book is a little bit like its own episode of a TV show or its own movie within this world, which is very endearing to me, especially with like the tone that it takes. Like it's very funny, and Greta Helsing herself is like a witty woman, but she's also a very like empathetic, caring person. Like she cares very much that like these people who are shunned by society or who can't be like out in the world as they are get proper medical care. What's really fun about this series is it feels like the show House if all of these patients who come in with these mysterious illnesses that need to be investigated were supernatural. And the way that we are like introduced to different like diseases or different kind of injuries that can be incurred for these supernatural creatures does almost feel like it could be rooted in like real medical research in a way. Like for example, something that's fun, there in the third book is about mummies. So she basically is hired to work at this mummy spa getaway in Paris, working on some mysterious illness that has been afflicting the mummies. And one thing that she emphasizes is that like she's always really wanted to have like a 3D printer in her own medical office in London so that she can very quickly whip up like bone reconstructions for mummies whose bones have been like, if they ran into something and their bone just like turned into dust kind of deal, to be able to reconstruct them. So it's very big about like skin treatments for mummies and like what would that entail and everything like that. So that was also really, really fun. I love stories that are very playful about mythology and let you kind of explore it in like a mundane way. And I think that this does that while also having central plots in each book that, like I said, are high stakes and are really fast paced and has a really lovable cast of characters. And like, I was like, not really expecting that much because I had only heard like neutral to good things about this. Of the very few times I heard anyone talk about it, but I was like in love with it. Like this is like one of my favorite, like one of my prized little series now. If you're someone who really likes supernatural style books with like a whimsical spin on it. I think you might really like this because I had a great time. Like, that's my family. So that is Strange Practice, the Dr. Greta Helsing series. All right, and then after I finished that series, the next book I read was Rogue Protocol, which is the third book in the Martha Wells Murderbot Diaries series. As always with Murderbot Diaries, I really loved it because I love Murderbot. So if you don't know what Murderbot is essentially this robot that is programmed to carry out security detail or more militaristic tasks in this sci-fi futuristic world. But our Murderbot, who is our narrator, has overridden their own programming so they don't have to automatically respond to any command that's given to him by humans who he's employed by, and is usually hired to protect on research missions throughout the galaxy and everything like that. This Murderbot is very much interested in being a homebody and watching the serials that he's overridden his programming to download onto his like mental network and be by himself. And he finds interacting with humans to be extremely awkward because so far his whole life has just been that he's an object to humanity. Like, he's just a tool to be used. And even though now he's kind of learning how to be sentient in a way, it's like hard in a very human condition type way to like learn how to feel your feelings and learn how to make connections with other people and accept genuine connections. So that's kind of the theme of each of the books so far. In this installment in particular, Murderbot kind of accidentally gets roped into this situation with this group of humans and their android that they have, and he was not hired by anyone or anything like that. He kind of just accidentally ends up on their ship. And one thing that was interesting throughout this book in particular is this is the first time that Murderbot is seeing a robot that's similar to him be treated as if he's like a part of the family of this group of humans, and that this robot has a very like human programming to him. Like, at first Murderbot is a little bit put off by this robot and thinks that it's like very phony and that it's like it's all programming and like, oh, this bot doesn't actually care about his humans, those humans don't actually care about him, like they're just using him, because that was Murderbot's previous experience with humans. And then throughout the story, Murderbot gets to watch how, you know, this inhuman bot and his human friends bond with each other, and Murderbot kind of experiences like this deep sadness and like envy for the very first time. And I feel like that's sort of the theme of this installment, is like him learning what envy and almost like wanting is. And that was really touching. So I really liked the theme of this book. I did rate it slightly lower than the previous two installments, but the only thing is because the plotting, I feel like, of Murderbot Diaries for each book a little bit is the same every time so far. Maybe that ends at this installment, and the next one, the plotting of, you know, the action and like actually the background, you know, the plot is like gonna be a bit different. But I did find it to be like, okay, I feel like I already read this with the other two books. But I will say, like, the emotional development of Murderbot in this was unique and really interesting, and that's my favorite part of Murderbot Diaries. So I still really enjoyed it. So I love Murderbot. I wish I had like a little Murderbot plushie. Do they make those? I might buy one, honestly. I want little Murderbot merch. So that was Rogue Protocol of the Murderbot Diaries. The next book I read, I think I was like missing college. I was a communications major in school, which everyone calls a fluff major, but for me, like, it was very serious business. Like, media studies is like a very serious business to me. Like, I love it. I finally read The Image by Daniel J. Boorstin. This is a nonfiction book. I don't usually pick up nonfiction. I was just craving something really informational. This is written in the 60s, so there's some outdated ideas, but I do think, like, this being essential reading for any media studies student makes perfect sense. Everything is still increasingly relevant, actually. Like, I think that Twitter would give Boorstin a heart attack, but how do I describe this? So this is about pseudo events in the US, and basically how pseudo events are described as events that exist as an image of themselves. So for example, one of the first examples that we learn about is like a hotel back in the day before like press and media and anything more than like a written newspaper was a thing. If you wanted to promote a hotel, the suggestion would be like, oh, you should get like refreshments, or like make the lobby more inviting, or anything like that to enhance the firsthand experience of the customers who will be going to this hotel that they can then express to the people in their lives about their firsthand experience being enhanced. Nowadays, it would instead, and nowadays being as in the 60s also is when he's talking about this, it would be, you would hold a press conference where you would invite, you know, notable figures of the local community, and they would take photos with the logo of this hotel everywhere. And the main goal of that event is not to exist to be experienced, it's to be seen secondhand by others. So even the people who are going to this pseudo event aren't, like, their actual experience of that event is irrelevant so much as the fact that the event even took place is what matters most. So we're just hoping that, you know, the photographers are there and the local newspaper is there that could get the word out that this even took place in of itself as opposed to like to be actually an experience that someone has, I guess. I'm explaining this pretty poorly, but the entire point of this book is to delve into what all of that means and what that looks like in our society. So I can kind of read you a couple quotes from this because I thought this was just really, even though it's stuff that I already kind of knew, it was really refreshing to read it in Borston's words. And a lot of people said that his writing is really dry, which is funny to me because I actually laughed out loud a lot while reading this. So that wasn't my experience. I had a really great time and I appreciated the way that he went about things. So one thing that I really liked is how he talked about how even our language kind of reflects the second-handedness of the human experience in the like media age. So here's a quote from that. "The awkward monstrosities of our everyday speech betray the second-handedness of our way of looking at everything. We no longer talk about something, we talk in terms of it. In an organization, a man is no longer important, he is at policy level. What we seek, we are told, is no longer wealth or glory or happiness, but a sociological concoction called status. We do not simply believe, instead we talk of the values we hold. We cannot do something in our spare time, we must cultivate it as a hobby. We do not study music or art or literature, we study the appreciation of music or art or literature. We no longer do a job, we play a role. We less often say we like a man or find him sympathetic. Instead, we prefer to observe that he has made a good impression on us. We do not find a person, we contact him. This is the age of contrivance. The artificial becomes so commonplace that the natural begins to seem contrived. The natural is the the non, is the age of the unfiltered cigarette. The unabridged novel, as the abridged version is the norm. The uncut version of a movie. Fact itself has become non-fiction. And I don't know, something about it was just really hitting for me. It kind of had enlightened and put into words this sort of like phoniness I've been feeling, especially in the era of like TikTok where everything feels so contrived and it feels so derivative and it almost feels like how can we claw our way out of existing where everything is derivative and nothing is an original experience. I often lie awake at night and get like stressed about it, and I almost feel like I'm being buried alive in that feeling of like, is anything I like authentic, or is it all just me wanting to be reflected as an image of myself that other people would like to see, kind of deal. And I think that it was a bit cathartic just to listen to that book. So one thing I will say, and why I didn't give it 5 stars despite the fact that it really did hit for me, is he is writing this in terms of comparing it to the Virgin America, which I think he describes as being like before a certain year, like some point in the 1800s or something like that he's talking about. But he's comparing all of this contrivance that we experience today to this point in history that apparently was uncontrived. And I will say, I think that he, as a white man, an old white man writing this in the 60s, was on the right end of the gun in that time period, and maybe that's why he's seeing it through rose-colored lenses. I think that the observations that he makes about the present day are all really, really relevant. I don't think that I agree with his overarching thesis that like, back then was so great, right now is horrible. It's a little bit like old man yelling at clouds kind of deal. And also like, yeah, easy for you to say, like, what about the freedmen? You know, would they have that experience back in the day that you're talking about? Probably not. So that's one thing to keep in mind, but I do still think it's a really worthwhile read, and I took a lot of notes and I thought it was wonderful. I miss school so much, my God. So that was The Image by Daniel J. Borston. The next book I read was A Dowy of Blood. I read this in one day. This is pretty popular right now. I think it's pretty popular on TikTok too. This is a vampire book, which I've been in my vampire era, and I think we all have. So I was excited to read this one. I had heard good things about it, actually very good things about it. And this is essentially about one of Dracula's wives who is saved by Dracula like at the hour of her death after a raid in her village, and she spends hundreds of years living with Dracula as his wife. At first, their life is extremely idyllic. It is very romantic. He is absolutely a dreamboat. He treats her like a queen. She's extremely grateful to have been saved by him. But as time goes on and more kind of spouses are added into the situation, so this is actually a polycule novel, more spouses get added into the situation, and as time goes on, Dracula's treatment of Constanza becomes more and more manipulative, more and more uncaring, and it's very much a story about codependent and toxic relationships framed as like vampirism as a metaphor for that. And I love that, first of all. I'll say this, I love that. I love the idea of like a vampire polycule. I actually think that doesn't get explored quite enough. I feel like if you were living for hundreds and hundreds of years, it's hard to have a singular kind of one person be your everything. And I think that this does kind of go into that. Sorry, it's a very cloudy day, so the lighting is changing very drastically, very quickly, and I'm trying to fix it, but I can't get ahead of it. We're just gonna roll with it. It's essentially about their relationship falling apart and Constanza and the other spouses plotting to take down Dracula to free themselves from this relationship. And this, I guess here's the thing. I am so AMC Interview with the Vampire pilled right now that I was thrilled to see this kind of as a plot and to see vampirism as a metaphor for a toxic marriage. But because of AMC Interview with the Vampire, this level of writing just wasn't deep enough for me, because Interview with the Vampire does this so wonderfully, and it was so complex, and Lestat and Louis' relationship is so gut-wrenching and is so nuanced that I don't think that we're able to get into that as much in this like 200-page or so, you know, short novel in the way that I was really looking for with something like this. So for me, it felt very surface level. It was very surface level observations about toxicity and about codependency, and about especially when like the man in a relationship has kind of isolated you from life. I think those are all good points to make, and I wouldn't say that this is a bad book. I just think that I was expecting more from it than I got. I would recommend reading it still. People were really complimentary of the writing style. I didn't hate the writing style, but it felt like it just didn't compensate for how shallow I found the book to be. I don't know. So for me, it was a 3-star. I was like, I wasn't seeing what other people were seeing, but I conceptually really liked the idea. I just felt like we weren't able to get there in the way that I wanted us to get there. And another thing about this is I was really excited for this to be about Dracula. This could have been about any insert powerful vampire. I think that we were just using the word Dracula as like for buzz, because we don't really get to talk so much about Dracula as like this mythological being with a whole identity and lore attached to him. We don't go into any of that. He's just a toxic man. So it was very like he could have been switched out for like just any random vampire man. So that was also a little bit disappointing. I was expecting a little bit more from the Dracula side of things. I just feel like as a vampire book, this isn't really a hit. As a like toxic relationship book, this wasn't really a hit. It's like a little bit okay in both of those regions, so I just thought it was overall okay, and I'm unfortunately not with the hype on this one. So sorry to say. But if you guys have other recommendations for vampire books that are thematically just like this, I'd be interested. So let me know. That was Dowy of Blood by S.D. Gibson. Okay, I thought there was one more, but there wasn't. It's actually for my September. I'm gonna leave it for my September wrap up. But that wraps up all of the books I read this month. Let me know if you've read any of these, or based off of what I said, you have any suggestions for similar books, especially weird little books like The Hike, or anything whimsical, supernatural in the way that Greta Helsing is. I'm really happy that I had such a good reading month, and I'm really happy that I found some new favorites in there. And I promise I'm not going to disappear for 3 weeks again. That was a unique situation and I won't do that again, I promise. I do want to keep updating. I'm still reading. I am still in the community. Your eyes and ears open. So I will be posting again soon. Anyway, well, thank you for watching and I hope that you have a great rest of your week. I'll see you soon. Bye.